Now let us see this river training works. The various purpose. First of all, what is the river training work? And first of all, what is the river? And what are the stages of the river? And why we have to train the river? And you can see the river. The starting point, this is the mountains where the river bonds in the mountains and finally they flows through various soils and various stages and meet this particular sea. That means during the course, that is the starting point, where this first point, entry point, these 2 points, this is we called as a course, and this particular point is known as the path and source. So this particular path, which we can say, and the end point, this is known as the mouth. So we can classify this particular from the mountains, the birthplace, and this is the death place, and the first point where the water enters into this particular channel, that point is known as the source point. And during its path, the river follows various stages. That means the entire path we divide into 4 stages. That is the rocky stage, boulder stage. The first one is, this is the rocky stage, boulder stage, rough and alluvial stage, and delta stage. So the various stages of the river, that is starting from the rocky stage to the last stage, that is the delta stage. As you move downward, the slope, that is increasing and it becomes flat. That means the rocky stage, the bed of the river consists of very big rocks, and usually the shape of the river is V shape. And due to this particular reason, we can say during rocky stage of the river, we can construct the best place or an ideal place for construction of these particular dams. And this boulder stage, the bed of the river is made up of gravel, shingles, etc. And this particular stage, the second stage of the river, the slope little bit steeper, and little bit comparatively the slope is steeper than the first stage. And when you come to the trough and alluvial stage, this particular stage, the river bed material consists of very fine soil. That means in case of a trough and alluvial stage, and most of this particular stage, we go for the diversion structures. That means diverting the water, and the bed of the river, that means the bed of the river in this particular stage is very fine particles it is made. That means these particular particles are very fine, hence we can say this particular stage is a very critical stage. And the soil particles always have a tendency to erode from the bed of the channel. That means the bed of the soil is very weak and compared with these 2 stages. So most of the diversion structures, as I mentioned, these diversion structures are mostly constructed in this particular stage. For example, this trough and alluvial stage, the big problem of this particular stage is allowing the water with high velocity, there is a scouring, low velocity, there is a silting. And the last stage, delta. And the river cross section, as I said, the rocky stage, that is a V shape, and gradually you can see the cross section of the river, the width of the river before it joins the mouth, and this is the source point, and this is the path, and this is the mouth of this river. And this particular one, the width of the river gradually increases from one stage to the other stage. As the width of the river gradually increases, the velocity v is equal to q by b into y. So as the b increases, and velocity will be decreases. Once the velocity decreases, naturally the sediment particles, that is during this floods, during this heavy floods, normally the water is in turbulent state. That means the water carries also the sediments. That means whatever the particles, sediment particles eroded from the bed and sides, these particles are also carried along with the flood water. And these particles, when they move with the sediment particles in from one stage to the other stage, when you come, the velocity, when it comes to this particular stage, velocity is decreases. Naturally, the kinetic energy is less. This kinetic energy is less, and that is half mv square. So because of the velocity less turbulence, and the small fluid particle, that is the water plus sediment particles, only water will be flowing due to the gravity, but these particular particles which are moving with the water, these particles cannot travel with the water because the velocity decreases, kinetic energy decreases, all the particles will settle down in the shape of delta. So in the shape of delta, the particles, all the particles settle down, that is the sediment particles, and the river divided into number of channels. It divided into number of streams, and finally during the delta stage, the last stage, the river is diverted into number of channels with a very less depth of water. That is the last stage of the river. So these diversion works are in the trough and alluvial stage, and most of our VS or barrages we construct in this particular stage, whereas this rocky and boulder stage is very good for construction of the dams. So these are the various stages of the river, and these particular stages, what is the phenomena happening, and river training works. That means we have to train the river, means in general it is the meaning simply the training of a river means to suit the requirements. The training of a river, it clearly shows that according to our suitability the river has to flow. That means the main purpose of this river training is to make the flow in a desired direction how we want. And making the cross section of the river is normally the cross section. For example, if this is the river flowing, and if we want to make this particular width very small, if the river width is to be very small, that means at a location where we want to construct a bridge, the length of the bridge is equal to width of the river. That means at such place where we are constructing the bridge, the river width should be small. That means we are making the flow to follow our trained path. That is called the river training. And as far as the main objectives of river training, if you consider the way we want the flow direction and the cross sections, that is the width and depth, we are making the river to flow according to our convenience. That is the main purpose of the river training. The various objectives of river training. Objectives of river training. The very first objective of the river training is to provide the safe passage of the flood. Safe passage of flood. So as far as the flood is considered as very unusual stage of the river, the flood is associated with unusual stage. Unusual stage, that means abruptly the depth of flow is changing, and in such situation, to make the flow within the cross section, we confine this entire flow within the cross section by constructing at the location where there is a flood problem. That means where the stage of the river crosses the bank levels of the river. In such location, we are going to construct the marginal embankments on both sides of this river and confining the flow within the cross section of the river. Thereby we can avoid the problem. This is one of the how the river is controlled, that is how we train the river to control the flood problem. The second problem of river training, the objective is to deflect the course of the river. Deflect the course of river. Deflect the course of the river. That means to deflect the course of the river means the river is flowing in its own direction and we want to make the flow to deflect from that particular direction, means to make the suitability to our point. That means if this is the river flowing like this, if the river is flowing like this, means if we can see the width of this river, the width of the river is equal to cost of the hydraulic structure. Suppose if this is the bridge, if it is constructed, if the bridge is to be constructed at this particular location and the length of the bridge is equal to width of this particular river. In such situations, you can control the cross section, by deflecting the flow. That means the point where you want to reduce the river cross section, that means the width of the river is to be reduced. That particular point where the minimum width of the river, that is the ideal place for construction of the bridge. That is the ideal place for the construction of the bridge. That means here we can see we are guiding the river to make the cross section, or the flow should be exactly perpendicular to our hydraulic structure. This is the axis of the bridge and this is the direction of the flow, and this process of controlling, deflecting this one by means of the guide banks. So guide banks are the structures, and this is the two guide banks on both sides of the river. These guide banks are constructed on both sides of the river to make it very clearly, this particular guide bank to deflect the flow. That means the flow is confined within this cross section of this river. That means the flow can move like this or cannot flow like this. You are deflecting all the flow from the upstream side to make it to flow through the cross section of this particular river where we are constructing the bridge, and thereby we are reducing the width of the river from a large width here. We are reducing the width of the river, and that is the one of the purpose of this particular river training. And as far as the third one, the third objective of this river training is, the third purpose of the objective of this particular river training, why we have to do, is ensure the minimum depth for navigation purpose. Minimum depth for navigation purpose. So this is the, as I said, a minimum depth. That means it is mainly useful, this concept, in case of the navigation. That is the purpose of mainly where we can go in case of a harbor. In case of a harbor, the ship, this is the sea, and we construct one harbor. This is the harbor. This is the harbor. A ship has to come. The harbor, the ship has to move to the harbor, from the sea to the harbor, especially for loading and unloading operations. We will do it at the harbor. These loading and unloading operations, when we are doing at the harbor, the ship has to enter this particular channel. So this channel is an artificial channel. That means according to the principle of the concept of the meta center and the center of gravity and the buoyancy, and these three concepts, that is meta center, center of gravity and buoyancy, the ship is heavily loaded structure, the weight is acting, and the volume of water displaced by the fluid, this particular volume of water, if the ship has to enter here, so this ship should not sink in the channel. Means the ship should float in the channel. That means sufficient depth of channel. If sufficient depth of water is not there in the channel, if the sufficient depth of water is not there in the channel, the ship, if it enters into the harbor navigation channel, the ship is going to sink. So to avoid this type of problem, that is sinking of the ship, we make the channel the increase in the depth. In the channel, the log gates, by means of the log gates, we adjust the water depth in the channel, and accordingly, when it comes, the water is released and it enters and leaving. That means the ship can easily enter into the channel and loading and unloading operations can be done, and this is called the training for the minimum depth for navigation purpose. The next point is to control the movement of sediments. And prevents into channel. That means control the movement of sediments. The sediments during the flood water, more and more quantity of the silt is generated. If this silt, if it is diverted through the, suppose a river where you construct a weir, this is the weir across a river, and this rise in the water table, this rise in the water level on both sides, you are diverting the water by raising the water level in the channel. Once you divert the water, this diverted water will have a lot of sediments, because at that particular point the kinetic energy reduced, more and more quantity of silt gets entered. So they prevent the entry of the silt into this one. We can control the point where we are constructing the weir, that particular point, as far as possible, the silt quantity entering must be minimum. That means this particular point where it is going to enter, maintaining the higher velocity such that there is a turbulence and it will never get settled. That means the points on the upstream side where this off-taking canal is taking place, this water when it comes here, almost all the water contains free from the silts or less quantity, and silt gets deposited on the upstream side. That means the water cannot enter into off-taking canals. This is also another process of the river training. The next point is to prevent the outflanking of hydraulic structures to prevent the outflanking of hydraulic structures. That means the places where there is a bridge, as I mentioned, at this particular point where you are constructing a bridge, outflanking means the water, as per this particular one, should not deflect from here in this direction. Means if the water is deflecting, outflanking of the hydraulic structure, again we have to increase it, which is not possible. Therefore, as far as possible, this is deflected will be avoided at a place where there is a hydraulic structure. So we are deflecting directly the river width of this particular channel to flow exactly and make the flow confined very near to the hydraulic structures, that is a bridge or piers, etc. And what are the various works here? The river training works classification is done by the classification of this particular river training structure. The first one, the high water training, for more discharge, high water training for so you can see here for more discharge, that is a continuity equation Q is equal to A into V, and the high water training for more discharge. So this particular one, as far as possible, the river cross section during the floods, sufficient section of the river should be available. Means more and more the discharge must be easily can be discharged from upstream to the downstream side. So high water training for more discharge is indicating the training of the river to provide or to make it to provide sufficient discharge. That means the cross section is maximum. That means it is a very safely you can allow the flood to pass through that particular cross section such that more and more water can be discharged easily onto the downstream side. The second one is low water training. This is by means of the dikes. An example here, dikes and levees. And second one, mean water training or low water training for more depth. And this is by means of groyans. So, as I mentioned here, the second category of the river training, low water training for more depth. You can see here, the discharge is immaterial here, the depth of the channel is more important. Especially this type of training is very much required in a navigation channel. The depth is most important such that the boats or ships should not sink into the soil. So such type of work is known as low water training for more depth. That means in a given channel where you are training the river, that particular place, the depth of river is very high, then what you require, we have to create the more and more depth than the normal depth of the flow of the river. So river flow is having some depth, but we are increasing the depth of the flow at a place where we want by means of training the river such that the depth of water will be increased. The last one is the mean water training for sediments. So the purpose of these particular sediments is these sediments will reduce the depth of the flow, and hence as far as possible we have to train in such a way that sediments should not deposited on the bed of the cross section. That means we are making the velocity, you are adjusting the parameter velocity, allowing the water to move in a river such that that velocity should not cause any deposition of the sediments, like that load will be a suspended load, or in case of deposition it is known as the bed load. So this is called the training for the sediments. So these are the various stages of these river training works, and stages and classification and objectives of the river training works. Hope you understand what is meant by the river training and purpose of river training, and what are the training works for this particular river training. So here you can see very main conclusion from this particular topic is the way you want the river should flow rather than its own course or its own path. The river forms its own path, its own course it tries to flow, but you are making the river to train according to your requirement such that you are achieving an stability in your river section such that the river trains or it flows according to your wish rather than its own wish, and you made the river to train or to flow as per your requirement. This is simply known as training of the river. Any training just generally the way how the person or how any phenomena to suit our requirements. Similarly, the river we made to suit our requirements. We are controlling its flow parameters like velocity, the depth, the shape, the cross section, etc. etc. All these controls we do it by means of river training, and that's all about the river training works.